All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep on something super important in drug development. It's risk management, but specifically in the preclinical phase. And we've got some great research papers and regulatory guidelines to help us unpack it all. We're going to figure out how to identify those risks
Yeah.
and how to assess them and how to mitigate them, all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's a phase where things can go wrong really easily. And the thing is, even small problems can become huge problems later on. Imagine you find a toxicity problem in an animal model. That's way better than finding it in human trials.
Oh, for sure. Huge difference. So I think our listeners already know the basics of the preclinical phase. So let's just jump right into the good stuff. What makes risk management in preclinical so different from, let's say, a later clinical trial?
Well, the stakes are just way higher at this early stage. You have so many unknowns about the drug. You're figuring out how it works, how the body breaks it down, how toxic it could be. It's all very uncertain, and that means high risk.
And of course, we're not testing on humans yet, so the ethical considerations are different too.
Absolutely. Using animal models has its own ethical concerns and scientific limitations. So in preclinical, you're managing those complexities too.
Right. Let's get specific. Where do the risks usually pop up? Our listener is really interested in the scientific and technical risks.
Okay, yeah. One of the toughest parts is moving from those in vitro studies to in vivo models. What works great in a dish might not work the same way in a living thing.
And I bet the animal models themselves can cause even more risk, right?
Oh, definitely. Different species can react so differently to the same drug. A classic example is drug metabolism. The pathways can be completely different across species. What's safe in a mouse might not be safe in a human.
Okay, so how do researchers actually deal with all these scientific and technical risks? Our sources talk a lot about risk matrices. Is that where they begin?
Well, risk matrices are a good place to start. They help visualize and rank the risks, based on how likely they are and how bad they could be. But, and this is important, they have limitations.
Oh, really? I thought they were like a magic solution. What kind of limitations?
Well, you have to put good data into a risk matrix to get good results out. If you're wrong about how likely or impactful a risk is, the whole thing is messed up. And sometimes they don't show you how different risks can actually interact with each other.
So it's a tool,
Mm.
not the whole solution. What else helps researchers with this? Our notes mention decision frameworks.
Right, there's a more structure. They help you analyze the risks and then decide on the best way to reduce them. They make you think about different situations, what could happen, and then weigh your options very carefully.
That sounds really useful, especially when there's so much uncertainty in preclinical. How would that actually work? Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's say you're developing a new drug for a neurological condition, and your preclinical studies show there's a chance it could be toxic to the heart. A decision framework would guide you through all the factors, like how severe is that toxicity? How beneficial is the drug? Are there other treatments available?
So it's not just saying, oh, there's a risk, stop everything. It's more about making a smart decision after looking at everything.
Exactly. A good framework makes you consider all the ways you could reduce the risk. Could you tweak the drug's formula to make it less toxic? Could you change the dose? Are there certain patients who would benefit more than they'd be at risk?
So it's really helpful for those tough ethical situations.
It is. And it helps different teams be consistent with their decisions across all their projects.
So we've got these tools, these matrices and frameworks, but I'm curious, how do they actually work in the real world?
Yeah.
I was looking through these research papers we have. Are there any examples that really show this stuff in action?
Oh, yeah. There are some really interesting cases. There's one study that looked at the problems of making a new delivery system for a chemo drug. They were trying to make it target the tumor directly so there would be fewer side effects.
Sounds promising. What kind of risks did they run into?
A big one was making sure the drug was released from the system at just the right speed. If it was too fast, it could become toxic, too slow, and the drug wouldn't work.
Yeah, I see. That's a tough balance. So how do they use risk management to deal with that?
Well, they used computer models and in vitro testing. That helped them predict the release rate in different situations. Then they did a bunch of preclinical studies in animals to see if the predictions were right.
So they were trying to find the problems and test solutions before even going to human trials.
Exactly. And that's a big lesson for our listener. If you manage risk early on, it can save you a lot of trouble later.
Definitely. There was another example I saw, a drug that looked amazing in early studies, but then they had problems when they started studying how it gets absorbed.
Oh, right. That shows how important it is to understand the drug's ADME profile right from the start.
Some of our listeners might not know what that means, though. Can you quickly explain what ADME is?
Sure, ADME stands for absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. Basically, it tells you how the drug moves through the body and how it eventually leaves.
Thanks. So this drug had issues with absorption. What happened there?
Well, they first used an IV, which skips the absorption step. But when they tried making it a pill, the bioavailability dropped way down.
Meaning it wasn't getting into the blood very well.
Right, and no one had really thought about that as a risk. They were focused on if it worked and if it was safe. They didn't see the absorption problem coming.
So what did they do? Was the project over?
Not necessarily. They had to rethink their whole formulation strategy. In the end, they used a different excipient, which is an inactive ingredient. That helped the drug dissolve better and get absorbed better.
So something small like that can really make or break a drug's success, huh?
Oh, absolutely. That's why you need a holistic risk management approach, one that looks at everything in drug development, not just the obvious stuff.
We've talked a lot about the science side of risk management, but what about the regulations? I know our listeners want to know how the FDA and ICH are involved.
Regulations are huge in preclinical risk management. The FDA and ICH have strict guidelines for everything, from how you design your study to how you collect data and write your reports.
So researchers need to know these guidelines from the beginning.
For sure. If you don't follow the rules, your clinical trials could get delayed, or your applications could be rejected. Sometimes that could even be legal trouble.
Wow, okay. Are there any specific regulations that are really important for risk management in preclinical?
There are a few. Good laboratory practices, or GLP, are really key. They make sure the data from preclinical studies is high quality.
So it's not just about the results you get, but about doing things the right way to get those results.
Exactly. And there are also regulations about using animals ethically in research. Researchers have to explain why they're using animals, they have to use as few as possible, and they have to make sure the animals are treated well throughout the study.
Yeah, those ethical concerns are really important. Now, I'm wondering how these guidelines actually affect risk assessment. Do they change how researchers identify or prioritize risks?
They definitely do. For example, if the FDA has concerns about a certain type of drug, maybe because of safety problems in the past, researchers will be extra careful when assessing risks for a new drug of that same type.
So you need to know the general regulations. But you also need to be aware of any specific concerns that the FDA might have.
Absolutely. Things are always changing. Researchers need to keep up with the latest regulatory news.
It sounds like navigating those regulations can be just as tough as dealing with the scientific risks.
Oh yeah, it adds a whole other level of difficulty. But it's crucial for making sure new drugs are safe and effective.
Which is the whole point, right? Protecting patients and making sure new treatments are brought to market responsibly. Before we move on, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the limitations of animal models. I know this is something people talk a lot about in science, and I'm sure our listener has their own thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue. Animal models are really important for preclinical research, but they don't always predict how a drug will work in humans.
So how do researchers take that into account when they're assessing risks? Like if a drug seems toxic in an animal, does that mean it's automatically a bad drug?
Not always. It depends on a few things. How toxic is it? How similar is the animal to a human? And how much could the drug potentially help people?
So they have to weigh all the evidence carefully and make a judgment call.
Exactly. This is where those decision frameworks we talked about are super helpful. They give you a way to evaluate risks and benefits systematically, even when the data isn't perfect.
It's like walking through a minefield. You need a map and a compass, and you need to be very careful.
That's a great analogy. Experience and expertise are so important in preclinical risk management. It's not just about checking boxes. You need to understand the science, the regulations, and what could happen if things go wrong.
So it's all about pushing the boundaries to make new treatments, but doing it safely for the patients who will use them.
Exactly. That's what makes preclinical risk management such an important and interesting field.
Yeah, it's a really crucial field. I think our listeners are getting a good sense of how much work goes into it. Before we wrap up, though, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned before, the role of technology. There's so much talk about AI and big data-changing drug development. What kind of impact are those advancements having on preclinical risk management?
Well, that's an area that's changing really fast. AI algorithms can analyze huge amounts of preclinical data. They can find patterns and connections that we might miss.
So it's like having a super smart research assistant who can go through all that information and find the potential risks early on.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. For example, AI is being used to predict if a drug might be toxic. They look at its chemical structure and how it interacts with different biological pathways.
That's pretty amazing. You
Yeah.
can save so much time and money if you can flag the risky drugs right away.
Exactly. And it can even help design better preclinical studies, so they're more efficient and focused.
So AI isn't replacing the researchers. It's more like giving them a boost.
Yeah, that's the key. It's a tool that can make human expertise even better. And as these technologies keep getting better, we'll see even more ways to use them in preclinical risk management.
I'm excited to see what happens. But, like with any new technology, there are ethical things to think about, like data privacy and the possibility of bias in the algorithms.
Those are definitely important concerns. We need to address those head on. As we use more AI in drug development, we have to make sure it's being used responsibly and ethically.
It's not just about the technology itself, it's about using it the right way, with good values and principles.
Absolutely. We can't forget about the potential consequences. We have to use AI to benefit patients and help science move forward, but it has to be done in a way that aligns with our values.
Well said. I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. This has been a really insightful look at preclinical risk management. I know we just scratched the surface, but we covered a lot.
It's been great sharing my thoughts with you and our listeners.
Now, before we go, I always like to leave our listeners with a question to think about, something to keep those minds working. So here's one for you. As technology changes the way we develop drugs, what skills and knowledge will be most important for the next generation of preclinical researchers?
That's a great question. I think understanding both the science and the ethics of drug development will be more crucial than ever. Researchers will need to be comfortable with new technologies, but also stay true to those ethical principles.
It's a fascinating challenge, and I'm sure our listeners are already thinking about it.
I hope so. The future of drug development relies on new researchers who are not only brilliant scientists, but also ethical and compassionate people.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. A big thank you to our expert for all their insights and to all our listeners for joining us on this journey into preclinical risk management. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of knowledge.